skill involved and all the work it takes to become, a great yoga teacher. And so, we want to support them.
Yes.
In that.
And that's such good work. On the, some of the other things you have going on.
I got a lot of things going on up in here.
You really do. Race in America.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, my goodness. So this is work that really, let's see, what do I want to call it? It was the first. So the maiden voyage, let's put it, right? That's the word I was thinking about. For Race in America happened last year. And it's a project with Sean Korn and myself. And, what we did was we wanted to do an immersive look at race in America. And in order to do that, the idea was to take a group of yogis to a historically relevant spot relative to race in America and just do some deep work. And we did that. We took 25 yogis last year. And in this one, it turned out to be all women.
Okay.
Right. And in this one, it pretty much turned out to be all white women and yogis. And, we went to Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, Alabama. And we just did some really deep work. We did work, through periods, through the period of slavery, through the period of Jim Crow, through the period of civil rights, through the period we're in now relative to mass incarceration. Mm-hmm. And to see how, as Brian Stevenson from EJI puts it, right, slavery really never ended. It only evolved.
Right.
And so we took this group and did just a ton of really deep work. It involved a slave ship reenactment. Wow. It involved going to the Peace and Justice Memorial. It involved we had a gentleman come in who was groomed in the neo-Nazi movement and talk about how that grooming occurs. And, then we did some work, really particularly with each other on how to go back, what we were going to do with all this, how this had this lens, it changed our perception and perspective and what that meant as we went forward in life from there on. And so it was, very impactful. Incredibly impactful. And so we've decided to do it again, right? Yeah. We learned some things from the last time. We know that it will be a much more inclusive group. It won't be just 25 white women. And we'll have deep conversations about healing, just what we've been speaking about, healing and transformation at a personal level, at a systemic level, at an institutional level, all of those levels in order to bring, a different perspective into the world. So we're doing it again in October. And I can't wait. This one is going to be a little more, last year it was 7 days. This year is going to be 5 days instead of 7. And we're going to Selma and Montgomery. This year we'll revisit the work we did in Selma. We will walk across the Pettus Bridge. Yeah. We will, go back to EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, and the Peace and Justice Memorial there, and so much more. And, this work is really close to my heart right now. Really, really, really close to my heart. In the addiction work, some of the things that one of the teachings we often do in that work is that you cannot heal what you do not acknowledge. And it's the same at many levels. We assert that racism, sexism, all those isms are deep samskaras. They're cultural, systemic samskaras. Just as we were talking about samskaras at a personal level, these are deep systemic and cultural samskaras. And another one of the things that gets the bullshit that gets put on top of us, like we were speaking about a little bit earlier, right? So it's excavating and looking at all of those things as well, right? So we can create new habits and patterns and all the things we were talking about a little bit earlier in this direction, even at the level of humanity.
Yeah. Well, and to get to that healing, and we talked about this a lot, the Off the Mat in the World 2.0 training, was that multi-generational trauma.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can tell you about some experiences from that, just, looking at the women who were there and some of the things that they found out, and particularly as white women, and how you could see trauma being held in those bodies, right? That kind of trauma sometimes relates in a numbness, in just many ways that it exposes itself. And because that was passed down too. We went to an area. See, I'm going off on a tangent now. I hope this is okay.
That's okay. It's totally okay.
We went to an area where it was clear that lynchings had occurred, where there was a slave block where slaves were auctioned and things like that. And we saw pictures of how that was a celebratory occasion. The lynchings were celebratory. And we was kind of thinking at that point in time, the whole town would come and you bring picnic baskets and all of that kind of stuff, right? To watch someone be lynched, which means you had to totally dehumanize.
Yeah.
You had to totally dehumanize. So we saw this picture of a young girl who was maybe in this picture, maybe somewhere between 8 and 10 years old, and watching a black man being lynched, and the horror and trauma in her face was just unreal. You knew what was going on by the horror and trauma in the face. Well, this is something that's been unrecognized. It's been unacknowledged. All of this stuff not acknowledged in our country. So that passes down too.
Right.
That passes through generations as well. Right. And then there was my personal reaction to this, right? I could feel the trauma coming up in my body once again as I was dealing through this. I just wanted to run. But you think about that. If you were involved where the lynchings, you knew people that looked like you were being lynched, you'd want to run too, right?
Yes.
So my body said run. Right. Yeah. And the white bodies were taking it in a different way. We hold trauma differently in different bodies. It was a fascinating. It was a fascinating immersion.
Well, I think that's the kind of transformative work we started this podcast to explore, that for healing to happen, there needs to be transformation at depth.
That's right.
And
that's right. And you have to go through it. We're right back to the beginning of the conversation. It's the neti. And I love that. Not this, not this, not this. All this crap that's been put on top of us so that I can be in the wholeness that I really am. Right. And, but I got to strip away all this crap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we all do.
Yes.
Yep. That's pretty broad, but some of us are not ready.
Yeah.
But those of us that are will be the leading voices.
That's right.
Moving forward of this is healing.
And I get why some are not ready. This is tough. It ain't easy, right? It really is not easy work. And one of the things that's required, just like in healing any addiction, is a radical honesty. And sometimes that just isn't, we put these things on for protection, right?
Yes.
Or injury or something like that. And they're hard to take off.
Right.
And so I, honor and understand, right? When someone who's not ready.
Right. Yeah. Can't force it. Well, I think that's the beauty of yoga is it brings us in touch with what has created separation.
Right.
And it allows us that opportunity to say, okay, I'm a white male. I've got white privilege. I need to acknowledge that and own it and say, where can I go with this?
Right.
And that's superficial, and then start going deeper and and deeper layers.
And then heal your trauma relative to all this stuff too. Because it's there. It's got to be, given the history of this country and the systemic things that have been put in place. It's got to be there.
Well, there's no doubt it's there.
Yeah.
And I, I look at my mother she's 92. She's
I love it.
Just visited her over in Ohio last week, and she's approaching the end of the road of her life. And I know your mom was 100.
Right. She was over 100.
Think of the trauma they held, but think of the lives they had. Yeah. It's incredible to just reflect on that.
Yeah.
And where was I going with that? I know my mom talked about a relative that was in the Revolutionary War. Okay, that's a traumatic break from Europe. Another relative died in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. For the North, and says white guilt has to say, but that's trauma,
right?
And that's like she grew up on a little farm in all white community in Illinois.
That's right.
So there's, my dad grew up in Kentucky, and he came and was a school teacher and a guidance counselor, and so there's these family histories that intermingle.
That's right.
There's shared trauma that's blended with living through the Depression and the upheaval of the 60s and 70s.
That's right.
And the age of technology where it turned a lot of things upside down.
Yep.
But it afforded us this ability to communicate in a massive way that's never happened in the history of man.
Yep.
And at a time when we needed healing. So that's part of the impetus of the podcast was we want to communicate with the tools we have at hand to go back and look at some of these very difficult things to unearth.
Yes.
And acknowledge.
For the purpose of healing. Just like we talked about. I'm kind of like you, did some family history work, but actually I was doing this work in a way to look at of course, addiction, which is my primary work, of course. And looking at where it ran through my family history and things like that. And I went back to a point on my father's side where my grandfather's mother, so my great grandmother, which is significant because I'm a great grandmother today, right? So my great grandmother was actually the child of a master slave relationship, which is rape. That's rape, right? So you got the trauma of rape running all the way through this family system. So, and no acknowledgement, no healing around it. So, yeah, you want to drink? That stuff hurts.
Right.
You want to do something to get away. I tell people in the addiction work, if I have a bellyache, right, I'm going to go out to maybe a health food store or maybe a pharmacy, CVS, to try and find something to relieve it because it hurts, right? It hurts, right? And so, that's one thing at a physical level, right? But what if it's an injury that comes from a psychological level? What if it's an injury that comes from, that hurts too. It really hurts. So I want to find something to relieve it. And I think that particularly in the domain of addiction, we have relief and resolve very confused, right? You can't resolve it until you acknowledge it. You can't resolve it until you go deep and find you can